Medieval art belongs to that period in history known as the Middle Ages or the Dark Ages. The Middle Ages is so called because of its placement between the ancient and modern world, and the modern world is defined as being born of the Renaissance. Like the middle child, medieval art long suffered from an inferiority complex, due largely to its resistance to being easily characterized, whether by style or time period in the larger sense as in ancient or modern. Now, this transitional period is complex but not without merit. Elements of ancient art, classical, Byzantine, Islamic, and Christian abound. At the same time, developments within medieval art will signal the coming Renaissance. The barbarians, the Celtic Germanic peoples, will conquer and assimilate Greco-Roman traditions. As they become settled in new lands, choices will be made as to what values hold importance to them and which values do not, perhaps an issue of even greater importance in forming the Renaissance. Now, we're going to look at migration period art, and the migration period is not a single time period in the history of medieval art. Rather, it's a category which includes work done by a number of different peoples over a time period covering nearly 500 years. Important is the individual characteristics brought to Europe through the barbarians, the first and second periods, and the role this art will play in medieval styles and the formation of the Renaissance. The Germanic peoples were the big-time invaders of the Roman Empire. They first made contact with the Romans around the year 50 BC. The Visigoths were alternately coy and ruthless in dealing with the Roman Empire. Here's an example. First, they're at war with the Romans. Secondly, they say, help us, someone else, the Huns are after us. Third, we're going to crush you. Apparently, the Romans carried on the Egyptian tradition of intermarriage with too much zeal, as the Germanic peoples eventually won out. The very nature of the Germanic tribes, that of being wanderers, gave birth to their particular art of small decorations for the warrior on the move. The art of the Germanic tribes was essentially abstract, deriving in some ways from an earlier style called the animal style. This is the eagle fibula from Visigothic Spain. It's gilt, bronze, and gems. Stands about 5.5 inches tall. Now, the linear quality of the art of the Scythians shows up in these eagle fibula from the 6th century. A fibula is simply a decorative pin. Now, two interesting points can be made about these pieces. One, it's geometric and abstract to the point of almost losing touch with the eagle's shape, with all the decorative line work within the form. Secondly, it's mixed media in a sense, not solely reliant on the metalwork to sustain the piece. It becomes a grid, support for the semi-precious stones which carry the work along. The strict geometric divisions in themselves perhaps called for the use of the cloisonné technique. The cloisonné technique involved filling a metallic cavity with molten glass and semi-precious stones, and when this hardened, it formed a permanent part of the metal article. Another aspect to this art is referred to as horror vacui. Horror vacui essentially translates into the fear of empty spaces. In some ways, much medieval work is reminiscent of Islamic art in this respect. The abstraction and linear quality of the metalwork of the Germanic peoples will pop up in the sculpture and paintings and illuminations of most later medieval art. This is a purse cover from the Sutton Hoo ship burial from around 625 to 633. It's gold with garnets and enamels. The length of it is 8 inches. The Roman mosaic interlacing techniques show up in this purse cover from the Sutton Hoo ship burial. This combination of interlacement with animal figures was unique to the barbarians. Again, as we've seen before, one culture borrows varying elements from several preceding cultures and combines them to form an exciting new language. You've seen this before several times this semester already. An interesting aspect of the abstract patterns is how far they stray from recognizability, yet retain an element of the original source. Perhaps the spirit of the animals frequently illustrated was so much like that of these nomadic tribes that they could not give up the image entirely. We're going to look now at Viking art. I guess we could call the art at the college that. Now, just what is a ship burial? I guess we could insert a bad joke at this point and say that, when the ship gets sick and dies, you bury it. But ship burials are described in Beowulf, the Anglo-Saxon epic poem from 725. Basically, a king's corpse and his prized possessions would be placed on a ship to be set afire and adrift in the sea. Send me over a cliff in a Maserati with a Count Basie CD playing and pictures of my family about. That would be my ship burial. Now, while metalwork was the chief media of the Germanic tribes, the Vikings took to wood. After all, it floated. Viking means pirate in the Norse language. As explained earlier, the Vikings raided the Germans who had raided Roman holdings. The Golden Rule was obviously in effect here. What we're looking at here is the prow of the Oseberg ship from the early 9th century. Now, the interlacing effect seen previously is a major aspect of Viking art, as is a continued linear focus, as evidenced in this from the Oseberg ship burial. This is an animal head from that same Oseberg ship burial, around 825 AD. Now, the animal head post from that ship unifies the animal motif of the earlier Scythians with the Germanic interlace pattern, but adds a great deal in terms of expression and energy. What a fabulously animated 5-inch tall piece of wood. Its ferocity contradicts its size. One can imagine this as a massive creature itself. Today's idea in art that bigger is better is a good example of why critics should be shot in light of works like this. Now, who are today's barbarians? Do we picture them as artists? Like the hunter artist of prehistory, barbarian artist seems a contradiction of terms, yet it illustrates the very importance of art to all mankind. We're going to look now at Hiberno-Saxon art. It's also called insular. This notes the Irish-English islands from which it came. The Celts of Ireland converted to Christianity in the 5th century. In addition to producing religious scholars, the Irish set out gamely to preserve literature, philosophy, and art. Their drawing on the arts of the Vikings, mingled with their spiritual zeal, produced some of the most remarkable art of the Middle Ages. This is the Tara brooch from Ireland, dating from around 700. It's bronze with an overlay of gold filigree, glass, and amber settings. Now, the Tara brooch also demonstrates the fine metalworking techniques and design sense of the Hiberno-Saxon artist. Fine metalwork, engraving, and stone setting make this piece a masterful example of the blending of form and function. Now, as in few other cultures we've studied, the 3D arts of the medieval period had a profound effect and influence on the 2D artists of the time. This is a cross page from the Lindisfarne Gospels from around 700 AD. It's tempera on vellum, 13.5 by 9.25 inches. Intricate interlacing patterns seen throughout the chapter abound in this illuminated manuscript page. It's almost as if these artists work with little concern for the apparent limitations of any given media, freely and easily expressing their ideas through metal, paint, wood, and stone. Rarely have we seen one people claim dominance over so many media. Now, not only is the design and style of great interest, but the use of color here is masterful. Note how the blue glows and provides a stunning break from the simplicity of the apparent complementary color scheme. Other pages from the Lindisfarne Gospels prove illuminating, sorry for the joke, in terms of their assimilation of other people's styles and use of other people. The designs here seem very much an extension on paper of the Satan Hu purse cover. The misinterpretation, in a sense, of the cloisonné technique fueled a new painting style. The many images from the illuminated manuscripts were copies from earlier manuscripts. Illuminated manuscripts were books written by hand, decorated with painting and ornaments of different kinds. Illuminated, in this case, means adorned. The three main types of illuminated manuscripts were miniatures, initial letters, and borders. A miniature was a small picture incorporated into the text or occupying the whole page or part of the border. Initial letters either contain scenes or elaborate decoration. And borders, some were illustrated, but generally they were decorative. This is St. Matthew from the Gospel book of Charlemagne from around 800 to 810 AD. It's ink and color on vellum, 13 by 10 inches. Now this and the following slides show differing approaches to manuscript copying. While not highly illusional or realistic, this image of St. Matthew from the Gospel book of Charlemagne is very classical in nature. This seems a rather odd combination, that of the classical forms with the outsized halo surrounding St. Matthew. This is St. Mark from the Gospel book of Archbishop Ebbo of Reims, 816 to 835. It's ink and colors on vellum, about 10 by 8.5 inches. Now, St. Mark here is less a slave-like copy of past glories in art and more a highly animated vision of the saint. This animation, or expression, highlights the difference between classical and medieval art. The lines in the robe are most dynamic, and the space is handled in an entirely different manner. Compared to St. Matthew's image, this manuscript is much flatter, with only vertical placement defining the spatial relationship of the forms. As many of these manuscript images were copies, it begs the question, why copy? The mindset of these people who preserved the Bible by copying it over and over was as follows. What room is there for interpretation in the Word of God? Hence, what room should there be in the interpretation of images in God's book? This explains the classical tendencies of artists like those responsible for the St. Matthew image. However, as the forger is caught because he can't completely cover up his own handwriting, so too were the medieval artists. And it's a good thing, too, as what they bring in terms of their own handwriting reinvigorates what perhaps had become a tired style through slavish copying. This is a symbol of St. Matthew, an illustration in the Book of Durrow from around 680, about 9.5 by 6 inches. As different medieval artists responded with different skills and ways of seeing, different representations of similar themes evolve. Now, what elements of the past pop up here? Interlacing and borders. Elements of the future are seen in the schematized mode of dress and representation, foreshadowing issues of proportion, as seen in the importance of the square in architecture. This is a symbol of St. Mark, an illustration in the Gospel of St. Willibrord. This is also called the Echternach Gospels, 12 3/4 inches by about 10 1/2, from around the year 690. Now, St. Mark from the Echternach Gospels differs greatly in that it harkens back to an early Christian symbol for St. Mark, as opposed to human representation. Now, is there a weakness to this image? I think it's a poor integration of figure to the geometric design. This is Virgin and Child, an illustration in the Book of Kells, 13 by 9 1/2 inches, late 8th to 9th centuries. And I think you can consider the problem of figure design integration solved in the magnificent Book of Kells. While medieval art's importance has been downplayed as simply being derivative or a fill-in period, we can see significant development through these last three images. Medieval artists did much to put the crumbling Roman house of art back in order. Now, one reason the Hiberno-Saxons played such a large role in this development is the fact that they resisted being conquered for a good period of time, roughly 400 years, from about 400 to 804. Now, what kind of art does a certain stability give birth to? It's something we've yet to see in this section. It's sculpture of monumental size. This is the High Cross of Muridoc from Ireland from around the year 923, and it's approximately 16 feet high. Monumental crosses like this were found in Ireland, Scotland, and northern England. Some were as high as 16 1/2 feet tall. Early crosses were often characterized by carved interlace patterns that were abstract on the body and arms of the cross. Through time, they became remarkably detailed and filled with narrative figural scenes such as those seen in this image. We're going to go now to the Carolingian period. This dates from the late 8th to the early 9th centuries. And the Carolingian period belonged to Charlemagne. Charlemagne was a neoclassicist in a sense. He sought to re-energize the Roman Empire and was crowned by Pope Leo III. Mosaics from that time depicted Pope Leo and Charlemagne along with St. Peter, indicating the seriousness with which they undertook their missions. Leo and Charlemagne were depicted often with square halos to show that they were still alive. One mission for Charlemagne was the recovery of the true text of the Bible, a rather scary thought. Can you imagine trusting a document of that magnitude to what amounted to a gossip chain? Now, while Charlemagne sought to revive the past, he could not help but be behind producing art that was highly reflective of those peoples who had brought on the collapse of the Roman Empire. While Charlemagne gives birth to a holy Roman Empire that will stand until Napoleon comes along, he does not raise a true Roman Empire, or art for that matter. The energy found in Viking art pops up in the Carolingian period. This is Psalms 43 and 44 from the Utrecht Psalter from 820 to 832. Now, with respect to art, translations continued to gain in the process. Here, a narrative tradition of early Christian art and a classical tradition of rendering the figure naturally join with the medieval penchant for line and energy to produce a wonderful vision of the Psalms. Here's Psalm 150 from that same Utrecht Psalter from 830. Now, this manuscript would not be read as anything but a drawing, and drawing can be a fabulously instructive media, as it does not seek to divert the viewer's attention with colors, textures, etc. in the same manner as painting. The organ in this illustration is also instructive in light of the fact that the first use of the organ in church services took place in the year 660. Now, apparently, monumental sculpture is not revived in the Carolinian period. Rather, like the nomadic invaders, sculptural concepts are to be explored in the smaller, so-called craft arts, as evidenced by some magnificent book covers. This is the front cover of the binding of the Lindau Gospels from around 870 AD. It's gold and jewels, 13 3/4 by 10.5 inches. Now, while this crucifixion may owe much to classical traditions in terms of style, and early Christian art in terms of subject matter, the work at once is seen as belonging more to the Germanic and Hiberno-Saxon traditions than to that of ancient Rome, as was proposed by Charlemagne in terms of his purpose to revive classical traditions. Now, architecture abounds as well under Charlemagne. He sought to revive Roman models, yet imbue them with the opulence of Byzantine. This is the interior of the palace of Charlemagne. The interior of his chapel is in many ways not unlike that of San Vital in overall design, yet its effect is more in keeping with Muslim or Islamic ornamental design principles. Whether one embraces wholeheartedly or seeks to ignore that which he has seen, it can't help but pop up in his or her images. Again, the best policy is to learn previous things so well that they become second nature, letting you draw naturally from them. This is the Torhall or gatehouse in Lorsch, Germany from around the year 800. Now, church exteriors still held firmly to the general austerity of early Christian basilicas, if only on the exterior. Even as the Torhall here recalls the Arch of Constantine, in no way would we mistake it as belonging to that period. Here the medieval Christian architect recalls the past, but does not let it get in the path of his intentions. This is the plan of a monastery. The original is from around 820. Now, while Carolinian architecture quotes from the past liberally, elements of the future pop up in this plan for a monastery. Two major characteristics are present here that would be an influence. Second, there was a second apse and altar on the west end. The purpose of these were unknown. And the widths of the transept and nave were equalized, and this resulted in a crossing square. This crossing square was very important because it would become the building block in Romanesque architecture, an element utilized to make orderly the increasingly complex designs to come. And this was a handy architect's tool as well. We're going to close now by looking at Ottonian sculpture. These are the doors of Bishop Bernward from 1015. They're bronze. The height is approximately 16 feet from Hildesheim Cathedral. Now, no longer do we have mere symbols for narrative function in Ottonian sculpture. The power, energy, and vitality of medieval art is crowned by these bronze doors. These two huge doors were cast in two solid halves. Don't ask me how. And are made up of 16 registers that range from the book of Genesis to the resurrection. Here's a detail. This is Adam and Eve reproached by the Lord from the doors of Bishop Bernward. The approximate size of this is 23 by 43 inches. The expulsion from paradise pictured here is a powerful communication of the scene. Each of the other narratives is as animated as this one, and the overall effect of the doors is truly greater than the sum of the parts. This is truly a miraculous conception and feat of foundry work both, and it was inspired by the Column of Trajan. This is Moses receiving the law and the doubting of Thomas from the early 11th century, ivory. Each piece is 9 5/8 inches by 4 inches. Then not so impressive, but also a part of Ottonian sculpture, were ivory book covers like these. Now it's just unbelievable, after looking at all the work in this chapter, that this art had long been relegated to second-rate status. I hope you enjoyed looking at it, because I don't think there's anything second-rate about any of it.